Aigusio Chugunabira. I'm Robert Fija Kajiwara, native Luchuan, also known as Uchinanchu or Okinawan. I am president of the Peace for Okinawa Coalition, based in Okinawa City, with an extension office in Honolulu, Hawaii. My petition to stop the illegal construction of the new military base at Henoko, Okinawa, has over 212,000 signatures on it. Since February 2019, my colleagues and I have been working at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland, to try and help stop this construction of the military base, as well as to protect Luchuan rights from US and Japanese oppression, and to restore Luchu's rightful independence. We have been working closely with other nations who are suffering under US occupation, such as Hawaiians of the Hawaiian Kingdom, Native Alaskans, and the Chamorro of Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. I have had the honor of participating in a number of UN panel presentations with Professor Alfred de Zayas. Professor de Zayas teaches at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations. He is a leading expert in the field of human rights and international law and a high-ranking United Nations official. He was the original UN independent expert for a democratic and equitable international order. He is also a former senior lawyer with the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Secretary of the Human Rights Committee, and the Chief of Petitions. He has authored a number of books in several languages. His latest book is called Building a Just World Order by Clarity Press. In it, he discusses what is being referred to as the Zayas Principles of International Order, and he mentions Luchu's right to self-determination multiple times. This, of course, is huge news. Luchuans are thrilled and eager to hear more from Professor Zayas. So I asked him if he would be willing to do a Zoom interview with me to talk more about his book and about Luchu's self-determination, and he was kind enough to say yes. Professor Zayas, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Robert. Pleasure to be with you.
I read your book, Building a Just World Order. I found it very interesting. You discuss Luchu's right to self-determination. Can you please tell us more? Why did you include Luchu?
I devoted my 2014 report to the General Assembly to the theory and practice of self-determination. And I made a specific recommendation that all peoples living under foreign occupation, all peoples who cannot exercise self-government, should address their petitions to the Human Rights Committee, but also address their petitions to the Decolonization Committee of the General Assembly. As you know, under Chapter 11 of the UN Charter, non-self-governing peoples should be helped toward self-determination. That, of course, entails education, not indoctrination. They should know what the options are if they want to have an agreement of some sort of commonwealth or association with a former colonial power. They definitely can choose that through a plebiscite if that's what they want. But the United Nations should ensure that the population is not hoodwinked, that the population has a genuine possibility to express their opinion by way of referendum. And in the referendum, as we know from the jurisprudence of the Human Rights Committee, only the natives can participate. It was a farce in 1958-59 when in Hawaii and in Alaska, so-called referenda were conducted. But it was not only the natives who were invited to pronounce themselves, but the occupation army, the soldiers who were there, were able to vote. All the settlers were able to vote. And obviously, the indigenous, the natives of Hawaii, the natives of Alaska were intimidated into not voting, and many were not able to vote because the uh, authorities that ran the referendum thought that they were illiterate or they couldn't speak proper English, etc., which of course is a massive violation of the concept of a self-determination referendum. But the United Nations was not involved. Basically, the United States successfully committed fraud on the United Nations, on the General Assembly, and on the world. Now, turning the clock back is always a difficult matter. Certainly, it's not something that you can expect to happen overnight, but at least revisiting the resolution of the General Assembly 1469 of December 1959 is in order because here you have a massive case of fraud. Now, that makes it essentially null and void, but that's legalese. What does it mean, null and void? The United States runs Hawaii as a state of the union. Same thing goes for Alaska. Like the situation of Luchians, it's actually worse because Luchu, which until 1879 was sovereign and independent, was first aggressed, occupied, and annexed by Japan. So Luchu, the Ryukyu Islands, are not Japan. It's occupied territory. And you would have expected at the end of the Second World War, when Japan was defeated, that the islands would be again allowed to return to their pre-occupation status as an independent nation with representations in diplomatic representation in many countries. And unfortunately, because of geopolitical and military considerations, the United States felt that a base in Okinawa would be actually quite useful. So the United States first occupies it, puts its bases in Okinawa, and actually the biggest bases in that area of the world. And then under Richard Nixon back in 1971, the islands reverted, supposedly, to Japanese sovereignty, although with a quid pro quo. Okay, you get, in principle, sovereignty over the islands, but we keep our bases. And not only do we keep our bases, but we expand our bases. And the situation is that the Luchians have been subjected to a double occupation and to a double colonialism under Japan and under the United States. The problem of the Luchians, like the problem of the native Hawaiians and Alaskans, is that they don't have a major non-governmental organization or a major lobby arguing your case before the Human Rights Council or before the capitals in Washington and in London and in Paris and in Berlin. So essentially nobody knows anything. Nobody knows even what Luchu is or the Ryukyu Islands, etc. That is not on the map. And the first step must be information. I have a chapter in my book. In building a just world order, I devoted a chapter to everyone's right to information, the right to truth. And there is a rapporteur on the right to truth, justice, and reparation. And that is one of the persons who should receive from the Luchians, from the Hawaiians, from the Alaskans, all the necessary information. It is in his remit to revisit the situation in Luchu and to make public the fact that essentially the native population of the Luchuan Islands are living under foreign occupation, which is contrary to the United Nations Charter. Now, what is new in my book, Building a Just World Order? First of all, half of it is brand new. Half of it I drafted just for this publication. But the other half is actually very authentic. It's excerpts from my 14 reports to the General Assembly and to the Human Rights Council. The book has thousands of footnotes, so everything that is in the book, there is a source that you can consult to convince yourself that that is the way it actually is, even though the mainstream media doesn't give it any publicity, but it is there. You can find it in the internet, you can find it in the library. These sources exist. But the book, which came out 4 weeks ago, hasn't had any reviews yet. I mean, has had those who received the PDF ahead of time shared with me some of their impressions on the book, and allow me to read a couple from Bertram Ramcharan, who was the acting high commissioner for human rights. He wrote, Alfred de Zayas is a gifted human rights lawyer who, alongside Jacob Muller was my boss. He was the original Chief of Petitions, pioneered the development of a United Nations human rights jurisprudence. He was a dynamic special rapporteur, as is evidenced by his principles for a democratic and equitable international order. Perhaps more, shall we say, catchy is what Maria Fernanda Espinosa, the president of the General Assembly, during the 73rd session in 2018, 2019, wrote about the book. The Zayas Principles of International Order are a modern Magna Carta. If implemented by the international community, they would help ensure peace with social justice in the 21st century, pursuant to the UN Charter. Member states bear responsibility for future generations. Hence, they should take concrete measures to achieve this rules-based order in international solidarity. I have here from Professor Dr. Carlos Correa, the Director General of South Center, from Sharon Venn, a Noto Q Musqua Manitokan expert, indigenous expert in international law, professor in Canada. She wrote, there are many books about human rights and international law, most of them a rehash of what we know. This book goes to the sources of law and proposes pragmatic solutions to many problems, including those of indigenous peoples. Now, let me go to chapter 2. They all mention the Zayas Principles of International Order. And Principle 10 concerns the right of self-determination. And let me say right of and not right to. Right to implies that sometime in the distant future, you might get self-determination. Right of self-determination means that you have it. You may not be able to exercise it because there are obstacles, because there are countries that are still occupying your territory, but you do have the right. And so I read this. The right of self-determination of peoples as stipulated in the UN Charter and in Common Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, is a fundamental principle of international law. In other words, it's jus cogens, it's peremptory international law. All peoples, without exception, are rights holders of self-determination. Duty bearers are all states members of the United Nations. The exercise of self-determination is an expression of democracy, as democracy is an expression of self-determination. It attains enhanced legitimacy when a referendum is organized and monitored under the auspices of the United Nations. Although the enjoyment of self-determination in the form of autonomy, federalism, secession, or union with another state entity is a human right, it is not self-executing. Timely dialogue for the realization of self-determination is an effective conflict prevention strategy. See my 2014 report to the General Assembly. The United Nations has an essential mediating role between states and peoples and should conduct self-determination referenda as a conflict prevention measure, because self-determination grievances often develop into a threat to the peace or a breach of the peace for purposes of Article 39 of the UN Charter. The right of self-determination has not only a collective, but also an individual dimension. Moreover, the right to call for and conduct a referendum is protected by Article 19 ICCPR. Now, that is the law, but there's a long way between law and enforcement, between law and implementation. In order to bridge that, you need information, you need the mainstream media supporting your claim. And as I earlier said, most people have never even heard of Luchu, or of Rapa Nui, or of West Papua, or of the Moluccans. There are human rights, and there are issues in the human rights arena that are politically correct, and there are victims that are consensus victims, and the rest are ignored in total impunity, like if you didn't exist. It is very unfair, but that's the way power works. Now, as you know, I'm writing a second book. This one, as I said, came out 4 weeks ago, and it has already garnered from some important people, also the Director General of the United Nations office in Vienna, some very complimentary comments. But in my 41 years of working in the field of human rights, as a professor of human rights law, as a president of NGOs and member of the boards of many human rights NGOs. I was also president for 7 years of the Association of Writers in Switzerland, the PEN Club, poets, essayists, and novelists. And as a senior lawyer with the office, as a special rapporteur, as a consultant to the office also. In these 41 years, I've seen a lot. I've seen a lot of double standards. I've seen a lot of manipulation. I've seen a lot of suppression of information. And that is the subject of my forthcoming book, which should be out in August 2022. And maybe some of the viewers would care to help me in the drafting of this book by suggesting to me some cases, some experiences that they know of double standards, selectivity, incoherence in the human rights field. Now, the book is called The Human Rights Industry, and maybe you can show your viewers the cover of the book. I have sent you the link to Clarity Press in Atlanta, Georgia, and there's a synopsis of the book which explains what the book is going to cover. And what I would appreciate buttressing with personal experiences of other victims of human rights violations, especially the unsung victims. I've always referred to the indigenous of America as the unsung victims because nobody realizes that in the United States, I know very well because I hitchhiked from New York to California when I was a young man. And what already shocked me then, or didn't shock me, it just impressed me. I made it a point to start jotting it down, is that tens of thousands of names of villages and rivers and mountains and lakes and towns and cities that all bear indigenous names. So you ask yourself, why is Niagara called Niagara? Or why is Manhattan, Manhattan? Or Massachusetts, Massachusetts? They're all indigenous names. That means that the entire continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Caribbean Sea to the Bering Sea, was inhabited. It was not terra nullius. It was occupied by the Europeans. And you had here the most devastating clash of civilizations. You had the Europeans coming as unwanted migrants and slaughtering the buffalo and burning the crops of the indigenous and essentially exterminating the indigenous. So you have here a case of genocide, as none other than Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in his book, 1964, Why We Can't Wait. This is a matter that really has opened my eyes to the manipulation of public opinion and the perception of history. What you realize, what you think you know, and only when you do your own research do you realize to what extent you have been misinformed, to what extent you're living not only in the midst of fake news, we're actually living in the midst of fake history. And with fake news and fake history, the politicians have made fake law. So the construct, I mean, our perception is phony. And I am sure that many of your listeners and your viewers realize that, but they have a feeling they can't do anything about it. I also had a feeling I couldn't do anything about it, but I believe that my 14 reports have had some impact. I have had feedback from so many persons who have read the reports, who have agreed with my analysis of the situation. But let's get back to self-determination and to the book. There is a whole chapter, chapter 5, which is devoted to self-determination. And in that chapter, I take one case study. Unfortunately, I didn't take Luchu. I took a case study of Catalonia. Most people don't know much about Catalonia. Catalonia happens to have a history of over 1,000 years. And Catalonia has a history of independence, a history of autonomy, It has had 132 presidents of the Generalitat, and they have their own language. It's not Spanish. They have their culture, they have their cuisine, they have their customs, their habits, their traditions. They are not Spanish like the Andalusians, or they're not Spanish like the Extremadurans. Do they want out? Yes. Why do they want out? Because they have been subjected to discrimination. It's remarkable how few the Catalans are in the Spanish government. The Spanish government is mostly in the hands of La Mancha, of Madrid, of Toledo, but not in the hands of the Barcelonans. And Spain certainly has not respected the autonomous status of Catalonia. There's another aspect of, that I'm also professor of history. I have my doctorate in medieval and modern history from the University of Göttingen in Germany. And I have taught world history also. I make reference to the Treaty of Utrecht, the town in Holland. Treaty of Utrecht of 1713. Most people have never heard of it. Maybe they've heard that Gibraltar passed to Great Britain by virtue of this treaty. But this treaty also was intended to guarantee the autonomy of the Catalans. But the new king of Spain, the Habsburg line died out. And then there was the 7-year war, the war of the Spanish succession. And who takes the throne? Philippe d'Anjou. Philippe d'Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, a Bourbon, pretty unappetizing individual, arrogant. Some people say he was mentally deranged. In any event, the first thing that he does, he's the new king as Philip V, is he devastates Barcelona. He just wants to teach him a lesson. They are supposed to be under the boot of Madrid, and there are many square kilometers of the center of Barcelona that were devastated by the new king, Philip V. And then they built a citadel there. You can go and visit it today because that whole area, the Barcelonans have rebuilt the area, and it is almost like a memorial to the genocide that Philip V committed on the Catalonians. They don't forget it. It's amazing how over 300 years you could remember the crimes committed by the Bourbons in Barcelona in 1714. And of course, the crimes committed by Francisco Franco y Bahamonde during his regime after the Spanish Civil War. He, prohibited the use of Catalan language, etc. He really suppressed the Catalans. So, notwithstanding 300 years of suppression, there they are, and they want out. They want to have a referendum. They have a right under international law. Unquestionably, they have a right to hold a referendum. But Madrid didn't want to have it. So when they did have a referendum on the 1st of October 2017, Madrid threw in the army at them and beat up ladies and shot men. I interviewed people who lost an eye with rubber bullets, etc., etc. The result of the referendum was overwhelmingly for independence, but then the army came in, it was occupied, and Carles Puigdemont, the then president of the Generalitat, went to Belgium, actually hoping to persuade the European Union or the European Commission to help the Catalans. After all, 7 million Catalans are European citizens, and 7 million Catalans could expect the protection of the European Court of Human Rights and of the European Convention of Human Rights. Well, for geopolitical reasons, the European Commission did nothing. And now Spain continues the campaign against Catalan political prisoners and continues the campaign to try to get Puigdemont extradited. As you know, he was detained in Italy last Sunday, and he was released the next day, and he has now been allowed to travel. So I suppose he probably now is back in Belgium. But you see that there's no protection by the European Convention of Carles Puigdemont. So you have politically correct victims and those whom you ignore. So this kind of double standards, it deprives the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg of credibility. They are playing hardball. They're playing cheap politics. And for me, I think it is absolutely outrageous that there have been political prisoners in Europe. People whose only offense, if you want to call it an offense, is that they want independence. That's all. It's absolutely amazing how you can invoke Article 1 of the UN Charter, how you can invoke Article 1 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and be put in jail for it. It's outrageous, and it's happening not somewhere in Africa or Asia. It's happening in Europe. And it's a disgrace, but with the complicity of the media. And that is also the problem of the Luchians. The Luchians do not have the mainstream media supporting your claims. You definitely have legitimate claims. You definitely have a right to hold a referendum. But who's going to help you? Is the United Nations going to organize a self-determination referendum for you? How to do it? Only if a number of states support you. In the case of French Polynesia, which had been taken out of the list of non-self-governing territories for which France was obliged to report to the Committee on Decolonization, it was put back in the list because Vanuatu demanded it. Now, if you get a Vanuatu or the Marshall Islands or Micronesia or why not a Latin American country like Bolivia or like maybe Peru under Castillo now. If any of these countries were to address a formal letter to the Decolonization Committee proposing that Luchu be included in the list of non-self-governing territories, if that letter is copied to the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, that letter is copied to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, that letter is made public. You put it on your internet, you send it to the AP, to Reuters, to the all the news services. Then the cat is out of the bag. Then you have a chance that at some point you will be taken seriously. But I know, and that's one of the things that I will deal with in my new book, that non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the International Service of Human Rights, they dance to the tune of their donors. If their donors do not want you to have independence or even autonomy, if the donors have other priorities, none of these NGOs are going to take up your matter, because the world is not what it used to be. I recall when I was hired into the United Nations service as lawyer for the Human Rights Committee. I was interviewed at the time by Theo van Boven, Professor Theo van Boven, who was the then director of the Division of Human Rights. We were a small group of people and very committed to human rights, very committed to non-selectivity, very committed to every individual who suffered. That changed over the years. And right now, as I said, the agenda is set by the donors. The financing of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is only a small portion is from the regular budget. The rest comes from so-called voluntary contributions. And of course, those who give a voluntary contribution will tell the office what to do with that money and what not to do. So to the extent that you follow the money, you understand the workings not only of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, International Service for Human Rights, but you also understand what's going on in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, what's going on in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, what's going on in the European Court of Human Rights. There was recently an important study published by the European Center for Law and Justice. I have here the cover of the report. You see here? The financing of the UN experts. And there you realize how much the donors influence the work of UN rapporteurs and independent experts. So my mandate as rapporteur on international order, my mandate had no money at all, because no one wanted to donate to that, since they knew that I was going to be independent, that I was not going to sing anyone's song, that I was going to do my research by myself and try to listen to everybody, outra parts, but the conclusion would be mine, would be honest, would be genuine. That they were afraid of. So it's a matter of conscience. It's a matter of wanting, or still believing. I mean, notwithstanding everything that I've seen in 41 years, I still want to believe that the system can deliver on human rights. And to the extent that I know that I have helped some people, I think that the work is worthwhile. You know, I was the first rapporteur in 21 years to go to Venezuela. Now, the disinformation on Venezuela is breathtaking, absolutely breathtaking. I read everything from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, from the Office of the High Commissioner on Venezuela before going on mission. And I was shocked to see that what I had read and the reality on the ground did not correspond. So I had been poisoned into believing that the government was oppressing its own people, that the government was not only incompetent, but it was corrupt, etc., etc. Now, I spoke with 16 ministers. I spoke with the opposition. I spoke with the Chamber of Commerce, which of course belongs to the opposition. I spoke to quite a few professors. I spoke to the churches. I spoke to civil society. I went out on the streets incognito to try to get a feel, try to get the temperature. And I realized that I had been lied to. I realized that the caricature of the situation in Venezuela that I had read was false. Now, my report reflects that. And what happened when the report was presented in September 2018 was blackout, total silence. Since I was not singing the song that was expected of me, total blackout. I had the experience. I mean, I published in so many scientific journals, from the American Journal of International Law to the Harvard International Law Journal to the UBC Law Review. I mean, I have hundreds of scholarly publications. I was asked by one of these scholarly publications to write a report on my visit to Venezuela. I wrote it. The person who asked me for the report received it very kindly and said, we'll be coming out in a few weeks. The weeks went on and on and on and on. And then I got a letter from the chief editor saying that my report would not be published. And then here it comes. Not because they've already published too much on the subject matter, or because it's not topical, or not the right moment to publish it. No, quote, because of its content, unquote. I mean, think of that. An academic journal that commissions an article, gets the article, and censors it because of its content. Because I am not saying what they want me to say. It is breathtaking. I mean, I sent it to a friend of mine who promptly put it on his blog. I put it on my own blog, and it has been published actually in several internet sites. So my work was not entirely wasted, but this experience will figure in my new book, The Human Rights Industry. Because you can see that a human rights journal addresses me. I mean, I was not offering them an article. They asked one from me. And they asked for the article, and they are so disappointed that I don't play the game, that I don't say the lies that I had read from the reports of Human Rights Watch. That they refused to publish it. Now, in any event, the report submitted in September 2018 was totally ignored. It was not until this puppet called Juan Guaido autoproclaimed himself interim president of Venezuela in January 2019, that suddenly there was interest in my report. And a journalist from London called me and did a huge interview. It was Michael Selby Green from The Independent. And when that huge review appeared, it was almost a whole page, that hit like a bomb. And then I had interviews with Sky News, with Euronews, with France 24, with Al Jazeera, with Time Magazine, with Newsweek, etc. But then you would think that once that the cat is out of the bag, that there will be further discussion. No. It's like you have a box, and you open the box, and you look inside and say, oh, how interesting. Oh, close it again. So they said, these are facts. We accept that they are facts, but we have a tacit agreement. These are facts without consequences. I mean, even in the case of Luchu, assume that everybody knows Japan committed war crimes, Japan invaded you, Japan occupied you, Japan suppressed you, violated your human rights. The United States keeps building and expanding its bases in Okinawa, pollutes the area, destroys the environment. Everybody knows it, but there's a tacit agreement not to do anything about it. That is more or less the kind of world we are living in. That doesn't mean that they're not people of conscience. They are people of conscience. There are people who do have an ear, who will listen to the unsung victims like yourself, and will try to do something about it. Whether we succeed, of course, is another matter. But I must say, I contributed significantly through my Venezuela report to a number of things. First of all, although it was not my mandate was to find out why is there an economic crisis here. And it's quite clear. The crisis was caused by US sanctions. The US has actually brought the country to its knees. The US has asphyxiated the economy of Venezuela. Forget about this narrative that the government is incompetent. It's not. They have technocrats. They have people who know what they're doing. But when you cannot buy and sell like anybody else, when you cannot extract the oil, when you cannot buy replacement parts when something breaks down, when your bank accounts are closed, when the US government actually steals $30 billion of the income of the Venezuelan PDVSA, the petroleum of Venezuela, etc. Obviously, there are consequences. I mean, it's quite clear that the scarcity of food, scarcity of medicine, the push factor, the refugees and migrants from Venezuela are a direct consequence of the sanctions. You want to help the Venezuelan people, lift the sanctions. But that is my report. I don't go into issues of arbitrary detention or of a rule of law, etc., because it's not in my remit. There is a rapporteur for rule of law. There is a working group on arbitrary detention. On the other hand, I did listen. I did receive an enormous amount of material from opposition, from relatives of persons who were detained. And I brought that to the attention of the foreign minister. And I said, look, you're all Venezuelans and you all live here. And you have to see how through dialogue you reach some sort of a compromise. So one of the things that you can do, and I've studied some of these cases, is to release these people, not to keep them in pretrial detention. If they are accused of hacking into the government's accounts or into the government's computers, etc., they don't have to be in pretrial detention. Release them. Release these people if there's evidence that they have committed crimes under the Venezuelan Penal Code. Try them. Well, in any event, shortly after I was there, they released 80. A couple months later, they released another 40. A couple of months later, they released another 80. And I had a lot to do with that. And I had a lot to do with new cooperation agreements made by the Venezuelan government with FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, WHO, the World Health Organization, the UNHCR, and I also proposed that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights should have an office in Caracas so that they could impart help, assistance. so that they could give what is termed advisory services and technical assistance, which happened. And the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, went personally to Venezuela. That I attribute to my work, to my proposals, and to the fact that I created a sense of confidence. I mean, I did, through non-confrontational approach, I succeeded in building confidence. And in my opinion, that is what a rapporteur should do. The rapporteur should not be on his high horse saying bad, bad, bad. Our rapporteur should say, you got problems. You know you got problems. I know you got problems. How can I help you? That is my approach as a rapporteur when I deal with a government. And if I were dealing with Luchu, I would try to speak to Secretary General Antonio Guterres and tell him, look, there's no question that the Luchuans have been denied Article 1 of the UN Charter and Article 1 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They have been denied this fundamental right to identity. They've been denied this fundamental right to democracy and self-determination. They must have a referendum as a matter of right, as a matter of law. And I think that Antonio Guterres, of course, he is in a very, very tough position. But he's just been reappointed Secretary General for a second term. So now in his second term, he definitely can be more inventive. He can be bolder. He can take risks that he would not have taken otherwise. Yes, you want to ask something, Robert?
So in February 2019, we actually did have a referendum specifically about the construction of another U.S. military base in Okinawa at a location called Henoko on in the northern part of the island. The Okinawan people overwhelmingly voted against the construction of the base. Over 70% voted against the construction, in spite of heavy pressure from both the U.S. and Japan to try to sway the vote in a different direction. And yet, both the U.S. and Japan have completely ignored the results of the referendum.
Well, that is similar to the case of the Chagos Islands. As you may know, the International Court of Justice pronounced itself 2 years ago concerning the Chagos Islands. Chagos Islands belong to Mauritius. And in the course of the decolonization of Mauritius, the United Kingdom illegally took Diego Garcia and the Chagos Islands out of the Mauritian sovereignty and leased them to the United States. The population of the Chagos Island was expelled, evicted, and there were a number of cases in the British courts that recognized the right of the Chagos Islands population to return to their homes in safety and dignity. And the case went up to the International Court of Justice, which ruled that they had a right to return to their homes in safety and dignity, and that the decolonization of Mauritius had been contrary to international law, and that United Kingdom had to repair the wrong. Repair the wrong, meaning returning sovereignty over the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, which would entail abrogating the illegal lease to the United States and having the base closed. Of course, big powers, two permanent members of the Security Council, consider themselves to be above international law. So the United Kingdom has ignored the highest judicial instance of the United Nations. And let's go back to 1986, when the International Court of Justice, in the case military and paramilitary activities of the United States in Nicaragua, clearly condemned the United States for violating international law, for financing the Contras, the opposition, for well, all sorts of interferences in the internal affairs of a foreign state. Well, the United States ignored the decision also. So you see that one of the major problems in international law is enforcement. I can give you the diagnosis. Luchu should have its independence. Luchu is an occupied country. Luchu has a right to a huge reparation to be paid both by Japan and the United States. Will Luchians ever get it? Only when the Secretary General of the United Nations takes it up and says, this is a matter of concern. This could develop into a threat or breach of the peace for purposes of Article 39 of the UN Charter. If some major countries, say China is your neighbor. If China were to embrace your rights and plead for the self-determination of the Luchian people, that would make quite a difference. And I think it is not out of the question. I mean, China has reason to be irritated by the activities the United States in the region, by the incursions of the US Navy into the South China Sea, etc. And one way of telling the United States enough would be by embracing the rights of the Luchian people and arguing that in the General Assembly, in the Security Council, in the Human Rights Council. Once the issue is put on the map, once people realize that Luchians do have a right of self-determination, then the situation changes. Then you will find more and more people who suddenly realize, oh yeah, that is a problem that demands a solution. And the solution is easy. I mean, certainly Japan can release the Luchian Islands into independence. The only major problem is, of course, the military presence of the United States. Now, in chapter 4 of my book, I deal with the military-industrial complex. I deal with the problem of the arms race. I deal with the problem of more than 800 bases of the United States throughout the world. That is scandalous. And as an American citizen, I resent it because it is my taxes that makes that possible. I think we squander more than 40% of the national budget in military adventures. And I see no justification whatever for the United States to have bases, military bases throughout the world. The Soviet Union is no longer there. The Soviet Union does not exist. Russia is certainly not expansive. Russia is not trying to impose Marxism, Leninism on the rest of the world. It's not like Khrushchev who said, "We shall bury you." That is not there. Putin is not Stalin, and Russia is not the Soviet Union. And China, if you leave China alone, China is not going to aggress you. On the other hand, if you continually provoke China, you are risking a mistake. You are risking bad judgment by somebody in the military who could then trigger the Third World War. Now, none of us wants a Third World War. And the presence of the United States and bases like Okinawa are a provocation. Also, Hawaii is a provocation. And as an American citizen, I would like to see these bases closed. But the United States, and especially the United States media, would never report on these issues like I am discussing it now. I could write as many op-eds for the New York Times or Washington Post, and I assure you that not a single one would be published. So it's you have a problem of censorship, government censorship, but also censorship by the corporate media. The corporate media is the sounding board of the Pentagon, is a sounding board of the Department of State, and like an echo chamber, they will argue the narrative that Washington wants the American people to know. Every other narrative is going to be suppressed. And if you make some arguments like Noam Chomsky makes them, or like Francis Boyle makes them, or like John Quigley makes them, or like Stephen Kinzer makes them, you get ignored. Just simply, even if it appears in some alternative news service, whether it's in the Real News or in the Gray Zone or in Democracy Now, it's just going to blow over because no one in power is going to take it seriously. So, Gutta cavat lapidem, that's the old Ovidius who said that the drop will eventually bore a hole through the stone. That means with a lot of patience and perseverance and insistence, you might someday reach your goal. And sometimes not even because of your own achievement, maybe serendipity, maybe some development will suddenly make it possible. When the, shall we say, world political constellation allows it, then suddenly it happens. Like when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Kazakhstanis, Georgians could all get their independence from the Soviet Union. It suddenly happened in 1991 when Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina all decided that they didn't want to stay within the federal Yugoslav state. They split, and it happened. You would not have anticipated that in the 1980s, certainly not in the 1970s, that Yugoslavia would simply disappear. But things happen. And I could very well see the Ryukyu Islands being given back to the native Luchians. I could very much welcome that, and I would see also the possibility of Hawaii returning to Hawaiian sovereignty. And needless to say, you're not going to evict the Americans, white American, European settlers of Hawaii who've been there for over 100 years. On the other hand, they are Hawaiians, and their loyalty should then be to Hawaii and not to Washington. I mean, that is entirely possible. The world is not going to end. The world is not going to stop turning around because of that. The world grew from 51 states to 193, 194 if you want to count Palestine. So what happened? Did the world go to pot because suddenly there are 193 states instead of 51? No. So, I mean, if the Luchians vote in a referendum for independence, they should have independence. And of course, your referendum against Henoko, against the new base, is something that definitely means something. The problem being that the mainstream media has not given it the importance that it has, and it has not been taken up by any state. And if it were to be taken up, as I said, by China or by Russia, if you want, by way of tit for tat, the US provokes China. Well, China answers with saying, we're going to support the independence of the Luchians. And then once that is on the table, it has to be discussed. But somebody has to put it on the table.
So, talking about the idea of a potential referendum for independence. Now, the US and Japan for generations have been exuding a lot of propaganda, right? The entire education system in Luchu is under Japan. They teach Japanese history, they teach Japanese culture and language and identity. They refuse to allow the teaching for Luchuan issues. So,
of course, that is a violation of the UNESCO Constitution, and that is also a violation of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Unfortunately, Japan is not a state party. Hold it a second. Certainly not a state party to the optional protocol to the ICCPR, so you cannot send an individual complaint to the Human Rights Committee. But it may be, I'd have to look into it, that you could send an individual complaint to CERD. At least they have a separate procedure, even if it's not an individual complaint, maybe something that could be, as I said, transferred by CERD to the Decolonization Committee pursuant to Article 15. Let me look into it, and I will report to you on that issue, because I do think that on the other hand, the special procedures of the Human Rights Council could offer an opportunity of giving visibility to the issue. The rapporteur on the right to education should be addressed. The rapporteur on culture should be addressed. The rapporteur on the right to truth, justice, and reparation should be addressed. Matter of fact, if you send the same complaint to 3, 4, 5 different rapporteurs, also to my successor, to Livingston Sewanyana, maybe with a weight of 5 rapporteurs, maybe Japan would start listening. Maybe the United States would start listening. Of course, the thief always wants to keep the booty. It's difficult to persuade the thief to give it back. But there are precedents of doing that. And I think that the first step toward achieving that is making sure that the audience knows about it, making sure that a certain percentage of educated Americans, educated Brits, educated Frenchmen and Germans know the claim of the Luchians. I mean, I will do my part. And I do have a lot of contact with my former colleagues as rapporteurs, but obviously as an ex-rapporteur, I cannot submit my reports to the General Assembly anymore. That is all the more reason to recommend to all viewers to cite the Zayas principles on international order, in particular Principle 10 on self-determination, and to make sure that journalists that you know the book, that politicians, professors start using the book in their courses of international law, human rights law, humanitarian law. It will all fit in any course on international relations. But you do need, shall we say, a movement so that suddenly, the book becomes discovered. I mean, I have my own blog. I mean, it's DeZayasAlfred.wordpress. And I have my own website, www.alfreddezayas.com. And I have a presence in Facebook and in Twitter. And I do what I can through my own avenues. But it would be important if Luchians, your viewers, your listeners would also see that there is merit in what I'm saying in the principles of international order, and that if Maria Fernanda Espinosa, President of the General Assembly, called it a Magna Carta, she must have had her reasons to give it that label. So I think that for the moment I will pause, because you didn't see it, but my dear wife Carla opened the door and said hello and said, "About cut." It's been long enough. But again, we can continue on another day. If you have one more question, I'll just answer one more and that's it.
Just really quickly, the construction of this base, U.S. military base at Henoko, Okinawa, is it legal?
To the extent that it is illegally occupied territory that belongs to the Luchian people, to the extent that the Luchian people have expressed their opposition to it in a referendum, it is, of course, illegal. But as I said, self-determination is not self-executing. And the fact that you have a culture of impunity guarantees that the perpetrator gets away with it. Now, I always say, concerning, for instance, the savage attack on the Iraqi people in March of 2003, the so-called coalition of the willing, when George W. Bush claimed that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq when he knew there were none. And when the United Nations had two inspectors saying that there were none. So the United States devastated Iraq, and that has caused the loss of about 1 million lives by now. Completely destabilized the country, caused internal strife among the Sunnis and Shias, etc. And of course, we caused it. I mean, we bear responsibility for it. But will the United States ever pay a cent of reparation to the Iraqis? I doubt it. And what does not change, however, is the validity of international law. Without a doubt, the assault on Iraq in March 2003 was a huge violation of international law. Huge. Probably the greatest violation of international law since the Second World War. But there is institutionalized impunity. Did it change international law? No, it didn't. You do not have a new rule of international law that permits a country to devastate another country. I mean, the attack was and remains illegal. What we do not have is a mechanism to punish the guilty. You do not yet have an efficient system of enforcement of international law. One last example, and with that I will end. Last week, to the great outrage of many human rights lawyers and many professors of international law, we read that the new prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, Mr. Karim Khan, decided to continue the investigation that Fatou Bensouda had started on Afghanistan, but only to concentrate on the crimes of the Taliban and not to investigate the crimes committed by the United States and its NATO allies, the Australians, the French, the Germans, etc. Now, what credibility does the International Criminal Court have when it applies double standards? It says, I will investigate these war crimes, but these people got away with it. I mean, that it was so, shall we say, obscene. I mean, I couldn't believe it that he would dare say something like that. The United Nations system. The United Nations, unfortunately, is only what it is. It's 193 states, and the influence of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council is, shall we say, decisive. And for the time being, there will not be any efficient way of forcing the United States to do what it should do. Unless you have a president like Jimmy Carter, whom I personally know and admire, someone who is willing to listen to others, someone who is willing to compromise, you're not going to make any progress here. As long as you have outright hawks like Trump, or shall we say halfway hawks like Biden, you're not going to have much readiness to release the Okinawans to remove U.S. bases where they are not wanted. As I said, if the United Kingdom was able to flout the judgment of the International Court of Justice in the Chagos Islands case, and the United States was able to flout the judgment of the International Court of Justice in the Nicaragua case, you see that the system is dysfunctional. You see that unless the time is ripe, and unless people have arrived at the conclusion that this is what we all want, what we all need, it will not happen. Notwithstanding, you have to continue demanding your rights. And I am optimistic enough that sooner rather than later, your rights will be recognized worldwide. And in this context, I wish you all the best.
Professor Zayas, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. It's been a fascinating interview. We'll talk again soon, and have a good night.
Thank you. You too. Until the next time.
Until next time. Thank you. That's our interview for today with Professor Alfred de Zayas. His new book is Building a Just World Order, published by Clarity Press, available everywhere, discussing what is being referred to as the Zayas Principles of International Order, as well as the right to self-determination and independence for Luchu, Hawaii, and many other nations suffering under Western imperialism. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.